Here's why self-care is the ultimate act of courage. So courage, by definition, is actually where we have control over fear in a difficult or dangerous situation. And when we then have a look at the actual true meaning of courage, it's to actually give you support, confidence, and hope. And when we then apply this to the actual self-care principle, then we have to have a look at how changing our behaviour and changing to a more self-focused approach is actually then going to have conflict or potential for dangerous situations to manifest themselves. But it's more so in the case of difficulty, but that's because we're looking at it from a place of, well, there are other people that either hold the space for self, in which case you yourself can have that space to grow within or to learn from or to develop within. But you also have the other side, which is where there are people that don't do self-care, and that's primarily because they are focused on external sources. And what I mean by that is we're conditioned from a very young age to be heavily dependent and reliant upon the outside forces or the outside influence due to survival. And these coping mechanisms and survival adaptations are perfectly fine when you're small, but what they don't do is they don't set you up for success when you're actually aging, growing up, and developing your own personal experience. And when you then start to step away from this whole system, in effect, that is tailored around basically everybody looks after everybody else except themselves, then at some point we have to go, well, hold on, we need the courage to be different. We need the courage to step out and do something differently. And the easiest way to look at it is if you're on a plane and the emergency system goes off and the breathing apparatus comes down, then we're having to put our own oxygen mask on first in order to then make sure that we ourselves can then help others. And when we do that, it obviously gives us a sense of achievement, but in the right manner rather than doing it in the reverse order. And when we put our own oxygen mask on, then we're then in a position whereby we can show up authentically, we can show up to our fullest potential. And that self-care element means that we can show up as the best version of ourselves in order to then project that outwardly and therefore assist and help others in their own journey, due to the fact that we ourselves have had this courage, i.e. the hope, the confidence and the support, in order to step out of the comfort zone that is just fitting in with everything else that's going on around us. And once one person starts doing this, then what you find is everybody who's not consistent with it, or they are old energy, or they have been around for a while, and this is the environment that you grew up within, will obviously start to push back. And when we have a look at the pushback is primarily there because it's highlighting the fact that you have changed. And it's highlighting the fact that those around you either can't change, won't change, or haven't yet been put into a position whereby they're kind of pushed or forced to change. And then what that does is it creates friction for everybody, but with the ultimate view of it being beneficial for everybody. And when we have a look at it from the perspective of, well, hold on, if everybody's benefiting, then I have to check that my support, or where I'm actually operating from, is reliable and is consistent. And when it is reliable and consistent, then I don't need to be tested anymore, because I obviously embody the process that I've been through in order to then externalize that and therefore develop my own understanding. So I then get to the position whereby I'm actually developing and I'm growing and I'm taking this on as part of my own existence. And because that's part of my own existence, then what I then have to do is be consistent in that existence. And because I'm then consistent in that existence, it will then challenge the status quo and everything else that everybody else knows and thinks that they are, in order to further develop change. But anything that's not consistent with that change will then obviously fade away or drop out or no longer form part of the experience because you yourself have moved on from where you once were. And when we have a look at the actual setup, we will then have people that are constantly getting triggered. We'll then have people that are not being triggered, but obviously not being put into a position where they're being forced to have a look at everything that's actually going on. So one person has to start. And once one person starts, then you start getting the instant feedback, because nobody wants to change unless they're forced to change. And that's primarily human nature. Because what we have is we have a system that's primarily based on survival. So you have to be the same or consistent with everybody else. So that 1, you don't stand out, 2, you fit in, and 3, you don't cause yourself unnecessary attention that may or may not, potentially or historically, lead to your survival being threatened. And then, because we then have the first person that actually does that and actually deals with it, then the rest are shown that there are other ways and there is the potential to do something differently. But ultimately, when they are given that option, it's whether or not you can actually get to a position whereby you can hold that space without the fear, which is the control element that we originally started with, that then comes back and then stops you on your own personal development. So where we then go with this one is self-care isn't selfish, right? But it is selfish because by definition it's self-care. But there's this stigma around how being selfish is a bad thing. But ultimately, if you're not looking after you for me and I'm not looking after me for you, then there's always going to be a deficit and there's always going to be a problem. And that problem will then obviously magnify itself because at some point somebody's resource will run out. At some point somebody will no longer be able to do the level or the input that they're actually doing. And when that happens, you then get a distinct drop in somebody's performance, but at the expense of somebody else. Whereas if everybody's actually looking at covering the self off and making sure that they themselves are fine within themselves, then everybody becomes more efficient. And because they then become more efficient, and because they're then doing exactly what's in alignment with who they are, then you get the exponential benefit of that growth and that development. And then we get to a position whereby we can show support, confidence, and hope in our own abilities and our own growth, which then radiates out to those that are actually around us. So that in itself is why self-care is an act of courage, because ultimately you're going against the grain and you're obviously going to be subjecting yourself to a potential difficult or dangerous environment that from a statistical perspective isn't beneficial when we go back to human nature. And coming through that and out the other side and realizing that you can be the way shower and that you can lead by example is more beneficial than you living an existence that isn't aligned and doesn't match up with exactly what it is you're doing or where you're looking to go. So as always, until next time, trust the process, and it's bye for now.